Good morning, everyone, and welcome to First Presbyterian Church of Farmington. My name is Michael Rogers, and this program is Ask a Question with my pal and our buddy here, Reverend Bruce Mulder. And we are here to answer the tough questions that you may have about your Christian faith. You can find past shows, of course, by going to the First Presbyterian Church of Farmington website. Click on Watch on Demand videos or by navigating to our YouTube page. You can also submit your own questions there at the YouTube page or pass them on to Bruce or I and email them to the church office. There's lots of ways you can get the questions to us. So with that, we are going to jump into questions. And I think, Bruce, this one is particularly appropriate because you gave a terrific sermon this morning related to the book of Job. And I encourage all of our viewers to go back and watch the replay of the church service to see and hear the job that Bruce did on that. And this question relates to the sufferings of Job and the sufferings of people from the hurricane from last week. So I'll kind of read this out. The question is, this is so hard for me to understand. How do people find joy when they've lost everything and even lost a loved one? How is God with us? Does this mean people are supposed to deny everything that just happened? God was not there when the storm destroyed everything. Why will he be there now?
Wow. That's a lot. 4 questions. Where to dive in? First, acknowledge the grief. I can't imagine grieving or loss in that capacity. And not to be Pollyanna, but God is with us. And at the same time, when you're up to here in the swamp, you're not thinking about that. You're wondering, why hasn't God pulled the plug, or where is God? I don't know why God seems so distant, so removed in those circumstances. I've experienced it in my life. I'm sure most Christians have. It's normal, it's natural, which doesn't make it any more appealing or appetizing. I really don't know. I wish all of that had not had to happen. I don't know why it did, and I'm not sure why God seems absent in those circumstances.
I haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure there'll be some people who will leap forward and say that this was divine punishment for the sinfulness of people in the hurricane's path. What's your response to that?
Well, God doesn't repay sin with destruction. There's the story in John 9, which I alluded to in the sermon this morning, where there's a man who's born blind, and the disciples say to Jesus, who sinned, because they're operating under the assumption that because there was sin, this is why this man was born blind. And the disciples say, was it this man who sinned, or was it his parents? And Jesus says, neither. So sin does not cause suffering. There are consequences to sin, but suffering is not, a direct result of that. And if you're going to say this was God's punishment for the sinfulness, then you've got to say that about every act that happens like this, whether it's a fire, an earthquake, a war, floods. I have a hard time imagining that God would say, well, I'm really angry right now, so I'm going to flood the people in western North Carolina. Now, having said that, you think of the flood in Genesis 8-9, and you remember the promise there that never again. But I don't know. These are difficult questions, and they're ones that are best not kept to self, but talked about. Talked about with other people, and acknowledged and say, I really have a hard time understanding this, because you're not alone. You are not alone.
I read an interesting perspective on disasters like this and related to the broader question about why do bad things happen to good people. And the explanation was that if good things only ever happen to good people and bad things only ever happen to bad people, where does that leave free will? I mean, no one would, with any sense, would do anything bad because it was clear that bad things would happen to you. But you could be bad and good things can still happen to you too. It's
Yeah.
it's your,
Yeah,
it's your choice.
or many of the texts in the scriptures ask, why do the wicked prosper? Why do you look around and you see the wicked are the ones who live an easy life? They don't have a care in the world. You know, they've got all sorts of cash. They're famous. They never have any troubles. Their health never fails them. Their families are perfect. And yet they're the most evil, wicked, loathsome people you could ever meet. And you're like, really?
Yeah.
Doesn't equate.
All right, let's turn to something a little more lighthearted.
Okay, that sounds good.
So from Genesis, so the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. This account from Genesis has been debated for centuries. Is this to be taken literally, or is this symbolic of the representation of the close relationship between the two sexes?
If you want to take it literally, I'm good with that. If you want to take it as an explanation as to how there are two different genders, that's fine. My take is that the first 2, 3, 4 chapters, especially of Genesis, the ancients, they weren't trying to explain the science, what we would understand to be empirical science. They were focused on who, God created and how God spoke. That's the emphasis for me, is that God did this. The emphasis I like in the creation story in Genesis 2, and I'm going to borrow this from one of my professors at Western Theological Seminary, the late Dr. Jim Cook, because he used it in our wedding. And there is in that text in Genesis 2, when Adam rejoices and he says, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and Jim Cook said, this is the greatest love song ever written. And it's not because Adam is saying there, well, scientifically, this happened. He's now realizing, I'm not alone anymore. I have a companion. And so the joy is not about anatomy or physiology, it's about community. And even for God too, God creates for community, for God and for others.
As Leslie likes to remind me, God made man, looked and said, oh, for crying out loud, I gotta give this another try. And then he made woman.
Yes.
Who might argue with her?
And they're equal.
So you can answer this one or not, but I promised that I would ask the tough questions. Based on who would be the closest, excuse me, a few respiratory issues today. So based on who would be the closest to Jesus' teaching, do you think it would be the Democratic Party or the Republican Party?
I think the closest that should be, or the people that should be the closest to the teaching of Jesus should be the church. The church is a hodgepodge, a group of people who are disparate, D-I-S-P-A-R-T-E, who live in unity in spite of themselves many times, who come from different backgrounds and different ideologies, different understandings politically, socially, ethically, economically. But they're the ones who should, first and foremost, be most and absolutely aligned with the teachings of Jesus.
This is kind of a history question. Did many Jews convert to Christianity during the time of Paul, or was it kind of a transition over a number of years?
I don't know the exact history, but in the book of Acts, and I can't remember which chapter, it talks about when the movement called the Way, and then there's a quote when they were first called Christians. But the idea is that the early Christians were Jewish. They would have had no concept as being Christians as we understand it. They would have thought of themselves as Jewish people who follow this Jesus. And the word Christian was actually a term of derision. It meant little Christ. It was a mockery, like, oh, you're following Jesus. You're just a little Christian. I don't know the numbers, but yeah, early on after the resurrection, the church did begin to grow.
Here's a question that I think maybe relates to Gnosticism. Talk about the Christian idea of a union between body and soul.
Body and soul is, well, Gnosticism is this idea that all material things are bad and will not exist. And that's the polar opposite of Christianity. God created everything, called it good, and God will one day restore all things, heaven, earth, everything in them, on them. The idea of body and soul in a human being is a Gnostic idea, that the two are unique from each other, but that's not the Jewish or the early Christian understanding. The idea that you have a nephesh, a soul, is that it encompasses every part of who you are, physiologically as well as spirit, breath. And so the Christian believes that in the same way that Jesus was raised from the dead as a body, a different kind of body, but a body, that's what's going to happen to us. We die, but we're raised a new body. That's something to look forward to and something to celebrate, that God creates and God redeems and God restores. And that's a good thing, to think that this world, which has had and has so many vestiges of wars and all sorts of things, that it's all going to be created and renewed, not blown up, but renewed, is exciting to think. Very exciting. And God says, Jesus says, I come down from heaven and I will dwell with them. I will be with them. I will be their God and they will be my people here. Yeah.
Here's a question that I think we maybe talked about a couple of months ago, but it's come up again. Many times we talk to folks, we bump into acquaintances who say, well, I'm not religious, but I'm very spiritual. So say, if you would, a word about the difference between being religious and being spiritual.
For me, as a pastor, I would take that on a one-on-one basis. If someone came to me and said that and wanted to engage in conversation, or I sensed that they wanted to have a talk about that, I would ask them, I would first say, what are your definitions of each as a starting point to listen and say, oh, okay, I'm hearing you define religion as this and religion and spiritual as this. My thinking is that when I hear this conversation, my default is I'm thinking that most people assume religion means going to church, being in a group of people. And my other assumption is by spiritual, they mean I can find God anywhere, I celebrate on the beach and all that. And so that's my assumption about what their definition of those two topics would be. But as I said, I would rather engage one-on-one and determine where that person is by listening to her or him and then having a conversation.
What is the significance of Christ rising after 3 days? I've often wondered about that. Why wasn't it 1 day or 4 days or 10 days? What's special or symbolic about the 3 days?
It fulfills the scripture, and I'm trying to remember which text it fulfills. Probably Isaiah. I can't remember off the top of my head, but that's why. And then in ancient times, Jesus was crucified on what we call Good Friday and was dead by 3 p.m, but was raised what we call Sunday morning. So that's not 3 full days as we understand them, but in the ancient world, that was 3 days. And so you have this time that Jesus is dead as a doornail, like Dickens says, dead, and in the grave, in the tomb, and separated from God. And I've heard there's Good Friday. I call that Saturday Silent Saturday, but there's a better name for it. Here's Jesus in the tomb. He's dead, and I think it's more difficult for us 2,000 years later because we know how the story is going to end. But it's difficult for us to understand what exactly might have been going through the people's hearts and minds as they were sitting there on that Saturday when Jesus is dead. Some of them are afraid. The disciples are afraid. Some of them are weeping and grieving. But the celebration and the joy of resurrection on the third day, as far as I know and or remember, it's to fulfill a text from the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament.
Certainly throughout the Bible and Christian thought that the concept of three appears the Trinity.
Right.
And that must have had some special resonance then too.
It's entirely possible, right? There are
Right.
certain numbers that have theological or biblical significance.
What do you see as the future of seminaries?
Woo!
I remember you mentioned before we started, you got your 25th reunion coming up.
Yes. Well, we had it. Well, we never heard anything about it, which was kind of surprising. I don't know that there has been a shift since I graduated in '99. At least in my denomination, seminaries are doing some newer things. At the seminary I attended, they've started it's a dual track of I think an MSW and an MDiv combined. You don't have to do that, but it's an option. Many classes now are online, or more and more students now are second career. In other words, they're not coming right from college to seminary. That was the case for me. I started seminary second career. I was in my mid-30s. Most of my friends in seminary were right out of undergrad. I think those would be and I think too, in my denomination, it would be the emphasis on the missional church, the church that's being sent, always being sent, and by missional, not exclusively the mission as we've understood it for years, as in the over the seas, but missional. You just go into the world and you are yourself a living sacrifice, a testimony to who Jesus is with your interactions with other people. I suspect that will continue, but I don't know. Yeah.
I have 4 grandchildren. I love them all to pieces. Sometimes I swear they turn into little demons. So, which raises the next question: is Satan real?
Well, okay, so you have Satan, which is what the name of the in Hebrew, the name of the accuser is in the story in Job, Hasatan. And the reason that one of the scriptures calls it the accuser is because that's how it gets translated. Hasatan is the accuser. Hasatan is not the same Satan that we've come to understand, who's the guy with a pitchfork and the red tail and pointed fingernails and all red and all that. Is the devil real? Well, look around the world. There's evil everywhere. Evil is a force. It's an entity, and I can hear my maternal grandmother. She always would say, "This is wicked," because she was raised on the King James Version. And as I age, I have a better understanding of what she's talking about. That when you look at a nation who is the richest ever in the world's history, and its failure to feed everybody, when you look at these wars that rage on for whatever reason, look at World War II. You have one crazy, I'll run out of adjective, but one crazy human being, and because of his madness, 40, 50 million people died, and the world has never really been the same since? That's evil. It's reprehensible. Absolutely evil. If you want to call it Satan or the devil, that's fine, but lead us not in temptation and deliver us from evil. It's real. It exists. It's a power and an entity.
We are nearing the conclusion of our time for today's program, but we've got time for one more question.
Okay.
So the brothers of Jesus, is that literal? Did Jesus have brothers or sisters, for that matter?
As I understand it, yes. It would be very odd in that day and age and in that culture for a couple to have one child. And there are a number of texts in the gospel. The first one that comes to my mind is when Jesus comes back to Nazareth, and is this Luke's gospel or Matthew? And his brothers and his sisters basically say, "Hey, look at this guy, he thinks he's Messiah." This is the text where Jesus says, a prophet has honor everywhere except where the prophet was raised. And then there's another text somewhere too where someone says to Jesus as he's sitting with some people, someone says to Jesus, hey, your mother and your brothers, I forget sisters, but your mothers and brothers are calling for you. And Jesus says, well, who are my mother, or who is my mother and who are my brothers? And says, those people, my brothers and sisters, are those who do the will of God. But it suggests that the very idea that, yes, there were biological brothers. I believe that. I think maybe our friends in the Roman Catholic Church, maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe hold fast to the idea that Jesus is the only born of Mary, which you can understand because she's God-bearer. You know, how can Mary then give birth to someone that isn't human, or someone who isn't perfect if she's given birth to Jesus? And I can understand that. I can go either way, but I say yes.
Is there anything you'd like to add as we wrap up today?
No, I can only, if you, as you alluded to earlier, you can hop on our website and listen there, or go on YouTube, and I think if you just go ahead and ask Farmington Press, it'll come up there as well.
Yes.
Whew, got that right.
All right. Well, our interim pastor, Bruce Mulder, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom and insights.
You're welcome, Michael.
Today's show, and thanks to all of you for watching. As Bruce noted, of course, go to the First Presbyterian Church of Farmington website, click on Watch and Demand Videos, or you can navigate to our YouTube page. Send us questions. We'd like lots of questions. Bruce loves the tough questions. We like to make him sweat up here under the lights and behind the microphone. But he always does such a fabulous job and helps educate and inspire all of us. My name is Michael Rogers. Thanks again, and we'll see you next month.